Hi everyone, and welcome back to PHA 3040 Medical Informatics. My name is Jeff Hearn, and this lecture is the second on two lectures regarding information sources. The first lecture was Information Sources 1, and we talked about both tertiary literature and why you should know your information sources well. During this lecture, we're going to talk about the strengths and weaknesses of secondary and primary literature, and also to describe the weaknesses of commonly used crutch resources. And what I mean by crutch are resources that people go to sort of reflexively without totally thinking about it. So getting right into it, we're going to talk about secondary literature. What secondary literature does is it helps guide you to the primary and tertiary literature. So it's not a true literature source because it doesn't take you into the literature, but it provides indexing and abstracting information. So indexing information is bibliographic data, that is the title, author, journal, etc. Abstracting consists of a bibliographic information plus a brief summary of the article, usually 250 words or so. You can use primary literature or you can use secondary literature to find the primary literature that you're looking for. Almost all of these today are in the electronic format and online, which is a great thing. The advantages of secondary literature are pretty great. One, you can use very simple search strategies. The information potentially can be very current, up to like within the last week or newer, and it's an access point to a tremendous amount of primary literature information. There's over 20 million articles indexed in PubMed nowadays, and you have access basically to any of that. The disadvantages are a little less clear. One is understanding the coverage of the database. So what is and is not in that database? When you're searching, what are you expecting to find versus what you would expect to not find, okay? And also when you're searching different databases, you may not be able to use the same search strategy. And so you may have to tweak your search strategy depending on which database that you use. And so you have to be familiar with that and understand that. The major secondary resource that we're going to talk about, although there are many, the main one that we're going to talk about is Medline. Okay? So Medline is, generally speaking, your first place to look for primary literature. The way you access Medline is either through PubMed or Ovid. Okay, both of these will search the Medline database, and they do have some small differences. Okay, there's a little bit of differences between each, and there's advantages and disadvantages to each, although they're very similar. We'll talk a little bit about it later, but very generally speaking, you're probably going to use PubMed as a Wayne State student because that's what you have access to. Wayne State currently does not provide access to Ovid. So just be aware, though, that Ovid is very commonly used for some people. Other examples of secondary resources that you can use are a bunch of databases that have long acronyms. So there's Embase, which has a similar concept of Medline, but there's more international scope. International Pharmaceutical Abstracts, or IPA, Iowa Drug Information System, which is great, although that actually I think they recently announced that's going to slowly be shut down in 2015. So that's going to go away. Google Scholar, which is decent, and the Cochrane collaboration, which is nice. It provides a bibliography of systematic reviews. So talking and moving on to primary literature. Primary literature, what do we mean by that? Primary literature is essentially journal articles that are clinical trials, case series, or case reports. And these are published in peer review journals for the most part. There's also meta-analyses, and you guys are going to talk probably for an entire lecture about meta-analyses, so I won't get into it. Meta-analyses can be found via primary literature search and are indeed primary literature themselves. And you can also look for primary literature which is unpublished. Okay, so there's unpublished studies. These can consist of posters from conferences throughout the world, which may or may not be easy to find. They require a bit more work to locate, but that doesn't mean that the data is not valuable. And there's also other quote-unquote data on file. So this is data that's collected in the context of an IRB, an unpublished study, internal quality data, and things like that that help people inform their decisions but may not necessarily be released to the public for consumption. So primary literature, the advantages are pretty great. They are the most current evidence if you're looking at current primary literature. There's a tremendous range of information, and you can personally assess the validity of the research, the pros, the cons, and how you should apply that information. It is very narrow in scope, which is a good thing if you have a very narrow scope question that can be answered with the same question as they're seeking to answer with this study. The disadvantages of primary literature is that there's an overwhelming volume. I may have mentioned there's over 20 million articles in PubMed currently indexed. That's a very, very large haystack for which to search your needle. The interpretation of the results can be a little bit sketchy at times, and it's up to you to really determine if you agree with the interpretation of those results. The quality can vary from excellent to terrible, and so you have to be able to recognize that because the authors are very, it's very rare that they're going to be open about a poor quality article. And then also a disadvantage is also that it's narrow in scope. So it's a good thing when the research question is clearly what they're seeking is the same thing that you want to know, but that means that it may not be applicable to a lot of patients who have a similar question to answer. And so that's something to keep in mind of exactly who is in your study, who is not in your study, and what are they trying to answer. So the peer-reviewed journals, you may know some of these names, and Dr. Giuliano will talk about peer review a little bit in subsequent lectures, but New England Journal of Medicine, Journal of American Medical Association, JAMA, American Journal of Health System Pharmacy, Annals of Pharmacotherapy, the Lancet, all sorts of things. There's also non-peer-reviewed journals, okay? So these are things like Pharmacy Today and supplements to many journal issues are not peer-reviewed as well, okay? So when you're using primary literature sources, you really have to look and evaluate the basics, which is what this class is all about. Is it peer-reviewed? Is it not? What is the reputation of this journal? What's the source of the funding? That's the basic stuff. Getting in deeper, you need to talk and think about the methodology, the statistics. What is the clinical relevance of these findings, and what patient population was involved? And so these are things that we're going to get into with primary literature because it's so difficult to analyze, but it's so essential to be able to do a good job analyzing it. There's another category of literature which I would say doesn't clearly fit the organization of tertiary, secondary, primary, and that's quote-unquote other. So I put it in other, but I think it's worth talking about just for the moment. These can consist of a number of different things. One, internet, okay, just things that are posted on the internet. Listservs, which are ways for like-minded professionals to ask and answer questions just via email list, which is very helpful. Medical news briefs, which are published, and local and national professional organizations and meetings. So these might be presentations at those meetings. They might be posters of data or presentations of studies that were done. Everything that goes on there may or may not be recorded, but you may be able to get access to it even after those meetings are over, which is very helpful. One thing to keep in mind with all this stuff, though, is that it's subject to some problems. So again, talking about the telephone game, I think I talked about it before, is just as a simple phrase can become convoluted in the childhood game of telephone, research findings can be distorted in the lay press. And so it's very frequent where you'll see a headline of a medical study and what it purported to find, and then you read it and you realize that that's not really totally true, or it was exaggerated to help get the article have more clicks and things like that. And so you're probably going to be well aware of that, but it bears repeating at this time. So some other things that you may encounter or have a tendency to use is something like Google. I will say I love Google. Everybody loves Google. It's wonderful. Unless I'm not even going to get into it. But it should really never be an early reference for you. As an example here, I typed in prevention of breast cancer because say you wanted to know something about prevention of breast cancer. Well, what you'll end up pulling up is 913,000 results you see there. And so if you spent even just a minute per site, it would take you 3 years to get through those 913,000 results. So that's maybe not the best way to narrow down what you're looking for, and it's not going to provide you with the highest quality information. And it's not necessarily going to answer your question. So that is something to keep in mind. There's issues with Google. It is good for looking up basic information. If you want to know about an avocado or you want to learn about the new Ford Mustang, okay, fine. But when you're looking for medical information, Google is very troublesome. Okay, so you have to then think about how to evaluate this website, each website you come up with. And it's way better to go to information which is substantiated and vetted in a much more systematic manner. So things of questions that you need to ask yourself are, which of these sites are accurate? There's a lot of incorrect information on the web. Which site is reliable? Is it up to date? How many of these sites are unbiased? Because a lot of them are trying to sell you something. And, as I mentioned, how many results is too many? You don't, oftentimes you need one good answer, not 913,000 bad answers. So keep that in mind. There are better ways to get what you want. Similar thing with Wikipedia. Wikipedia, it's hard to argue with the concept of Wikipedia. It's a very nice resource for many things. However, again, it's created by anonymous users who are often not experts in the content. There are studies that say that it's as good as Encyclopedia Britannica. However, it's still not the best reference to use if you're going to care for a patient. So, who is this site edited by? You have no idea who it's edited by. Are factual statements referenced? A lot of times there are factual statements that are not referenced, or even if they are, they don't accurately convey the information that was stated in that reference. It's taken out of context or overgeneralized, etc. Vandalism is something that also happens, so you want to beware about controversial subjects because an undue weight policy exists with Wikipedia, which is not commonly talked about. For controversial subjects, they will only present the majority view. And the majority view may not necessarily be what you want. And so you want to beware of controversial subjects and don't go to Wikipedia for that stuff. Again, you have better references available to you. There's a whole bunch of stuff on Access Pharmacy, PubMed, all these electronic texts in drug information databases. There's wonderful things. Don't fall back on Wikipedia out of habit. So when you're assessing the validity of web sources, there are things you need to look at. Who is creating this? Who owns it? Who are the contributors? Do you know who's contributed? Do they have any credentials? Not that credentials are necessary, but they help validate what that person's experience and education level is. Are you able to contact them in any way to clarify information or correct things that are incorrect on the site? Does it have references? Is it linked to primary literature studies? Sometimes references just link to, Mayo Clinic website. Well, Mayo Clinic's website is nice, but that's sort of a by proxy type reference. That's not really referencing. Also, what is the timeliness? These are frequently websites where it'll be posted, but you can't tell if it was posted yesterday or 5 years ago. And so when was it posted, when it was revised, you may not know, and that's problematic as well. Do you have to pay? Who's able to get onto it? What's the level of privacy available? And also who's funding and sponsoring the site? If there's no advertisements on the site, it may be the case that the actual site itself is an advertisement and it's presented in a way to not clearly look like an advertisement. So in general, I would say there are innumerable amount of resources available to you, but there's no perfect reference. You're not going to find one thing that's good for everything. So that's the value of specialized references, that they're able to answer your very specific question in a very specific way. Because of that, they may not be good at other things. And make sure that you explore the references that you have so you're comfortable with the contents of each. Many of us are going to move around throughout our careers, and you want to reorient yourself to your environment, not just your coworkers and your boss and what your responsibilities are, but when you need a reference, what tools are going to be in your toolbox while you're working in that location. Broad scope references are typically nice for simple questions. So broad scope references, I mean like lexicon, micromedics, etc. Narrow scope references are best for very specific issues. Examples, that drug and pregnancy and lactation book that I talked about. So the very general concepts to say is that, ease of use, tertiary references are easier than primary references, which get much, much more difficult to use very quickly. At the same time, there's a trade-off there because primary literature tends to be much more current than the tertiary literature that can be 4 or 5 years by the time it's able to even come into your hands. And so you really need to balance these issues and again, think about what is the place that's most likely to answer my question and do so in a way that provides the correct course of action for your particular patient. So at a minimum, I would say try to have a go-to reference you know well. We talked about this during the drug database thing, but that way you can find information quickly and effectively. Basic stuff like how does this drug work, what class is it in, what are the adverse effects, those types of things to either help others out or just familiarize yourself. And then know what other resources are available to you. We talked about that, but also be aware of the national organizations and consensus groups, Center for Disease Control, Infectious Diseases Society of America, American Diabetes Association. Know who those groups are because they produce guidelines that can help you out. The other thing you want to do is review the literature yourself and be sure to form your own opinion, okay? Don't take everything at face value and be objective because you're going to run into a lot of studies that give you actually or come to the wrong conclusion, and you want to be able to figure out which studies those are. Also, very few questions are black and white. It'd be very nice if there's an easy answer to everything. However, if there was an easy answer, someone's probably not asking you. So you want to understand the risks and benefits of any course of action or drug and know how to balance them appropriately for this specific patient. Not every patient in general, but the specific patient you're talking to, and with their concomitant disease states, other drugs that they're on, things like that. You want to keep that in mind. And then finally, just learn to communicate well. Be firm and definitive when the answer is clear so people know where you stand. But just be informative and purposeful when it is not. And again, getting back to that problem thing out there, just what's the problem? Let's try to work through it rather than, what's the answer, quote unquote, to this very simple question. So I hope that is helpful. That's it for my mini lectures. And I hope you enjoy the class. I hope these lectures provided a nice overview and introduction into drug information, resources, and what information you have available. Best of luck, and I will see you in class.